My name is Anna. I'm the facilitator of idtalks. idtalks is organized by Salto Inclusion and Diversity since autumn of 2020. So we are in our 11th season right now. And this autumn of 2025, the idtalks is looking at the topic of social justice. We are looking into the dynamic between structural change and individual integration or inclusion. We are focusing on individual needs while also at the same time focusing on the developing inclusive, diversity sensitive structures that eliminate barriers for all. And we are discussing every time a different topic connected to social justice. Today is our third talk of the series, and its title is idtalks: Social Justice and Human Rights. How are human rights regarded in today's society? Are there maybe any new concepts and definitions, and how they are reflecting the reality of human rights today? What is the role of youth work in promoting, advocating, and defending human rights? We will look into these interesting topics and try to find answers to these questions with our today's guest speaker, Neringa Tumėnaitė. I hope I pronounced that right, from UK and Lithuania. Neringa is a PhD candidate in SOAS University of London, researching youth empowerment within decolonial dynamics in contemporary political economy. Her work examines tensions between institutional cooperation and transformative potential, exploring alternative frameworks for planetary well-being. So, Neringa, without further ado, I would like to pass you the floor, and I'm personally really excited to learn more in today's talk.
Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad you chose to dedicate your time and energy to listen to this talk. I have been working in the human rights sector as both a volunteer and expert for around 10 years, so I have been largely a proponent. However, today I would like to offer a more critical reading and view towards human rights and the whole development of the humanistic discourse, touching upon not only issues related to war, genocide, but also those to planetary well-being, and looking into how human rights can compete with rights of nature and those of broader ecosystems. So more broadly, what is on the menu today? We will dive into the development of human rights discourse, law, and links to coloniality. I will also aim to discuss the contemporary crisis of the idea of human rights as a whole, young people, civil disobedience, and its role in advancing social justice, as well as competing and complementary epistemological positionalities, and finally, potential youth sector responses. So when did the human rights discourse begin? Actually, as probably most of you know, it did not start with the UN. I'll just share some brief examples of the discourse from the 13th century. So we had Magna Carta, of course, in England, which was the foundation for the individual rights, already established in 1215, and it was written. Then we had the Mande Charter in Mali Empire, so between modern days Mali and Guinea, which spoke of matters of peace, education, and freedom of expression. This was captured through the oral traditions of the griots, so Western African storytellers, and was written only much later. So of course there's a scholarly debate of the wording of some of it, but the main spirit is related to the larger human rights frameworks. And another interesting discourse, which I found, was related to the pagan appeals from the Baltic states in writing letters to the Pope opposing the looting of the knights and arguing for freedom of religion and dignity. Modern scholars such as Hubgood ask us to differentiate between human rights and human rights in capital letters. So he defines the latter as the following. Human rights as a global structure of laws, courts, norms, and organizations that raise money, write reports, run international campaigns, open local offices, and lobby governments, and claim to speak with a singular authority of humanity as a whole, and requests for a kind of universal and secular moral authority. And as we will see, this does come with complications. So one of the dangers of uncritical veneration of human rights is Western centrism. And as Hubgood says, all major powers seek to realize their national interests, but usually it's only when the US or Europe does it, it's dressed in the language of a kind of moral progress or superiority. This then also bleeds into the potential co-option of youth engagement and youth work. So for example, Sukarriech and Tarnok found that some youth policy serves to replace, silence, and contain kind of more progressive youth movements by absorbing their language and then neutralizing the transformative potential. We have seen it happen with, for example, participatory mechanisms, which came from this really radical tradition supported by Freire in advocating for systems change, whereas now we do see that organizations including World Bank or World Economic Forum also have youth participatory boards to kind of show how they're empowering young people. Nevertheless, young people are only invited to debate within kind of very rigidly established boundaries. Going back to how the human rights and the humanism itself evolved, we see it as a kind of sacral replacement for the Christian God. Nietzsche argued that God has been thoroughly refuted, hence it will lead to the collapse of the whole of European morality. And therefore, the leading oldest humanitarian organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, operated as a kind of secular church of the international, in itself arguing for being impartial, nevertheless rooted in very much the strong sentiment of helping the suffering innocent, which in itself can be viewed in a positive light of helping people, but also kind of carrying this saviorism sentiment. And the founders felt that they have the moral sense to help protect the human life and help ease the torments of the wounded. And actually, it was one of its co-founders, the Gustave Moynier, who proposed a permanent court to establish justice and trial the crimes of the Franco-Prussian War. The legal takeoff of human rights in Europe and in part globally happened not only due to this sort of spiritual crisis within Europe, but also in relation to one of the big crimes that were committed, which is a Holocaust, which, as Hubgood argues, kind of shook the premise of moral superiority and cultural arrogance within Europe as this beacon of light for the rest of the world. And here I'll share the quote of the Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, who argued that the unique feature of Holocaust is that it gave birth to the international human rights movement. If future perpetrators of genocide, crime against humanity are brought to justice, then millions of innocent victims who perished will not have died in vain. It is certainly not too much to hope that efficient justice will also serve to deter war crimes in the future. So of course, we see that the prophecy perhaps did not come true, but that was one of the intentions of developing the court system and also some of the treaties that came after. And Europe was really trying to position itself as a center, as a kind of recovery and at the headquarters of human rights, and the UNESCO headquarters were established there, as well as the International Criminal Court of Justice. The first truly international human rights treaties were also signed in Europe, in Paris, during 1948 UN General Assembly. And it came together with the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, signed on December 9th. And then just a day later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed as well. I'm actually quite neutral, or maybe overall even positive in my view of the International Criminal Court. But I would like to offer a more kind of nuanced, critical reading that some scholars have that I think do raise some reasonable questions. So, for example, Hopgood describes it as European vanity project. And he argues that the true tragedy is that the court cannot exercise political jurisdiction over great powers. So essentially, it just establishes a two-tier system where the strong states discipline the weak, but the weak states struggle in kind of getting the same power. And hence, he named it Europe's Court for Africa, even though it has tried leaders from different countries, and gives the example of French intervention in Mali as a kind of textbook example of how Africa remains Europe's moral laboratory when great power interests are not at stake. And we definitely see it play out in the recent ICC case, which South Africa brought against the state of Israel. And the ICC did make a ruling for the state to stop inflicting unlivable conditions to prevent and punish incitement to commit genocide, and enable the provision of humanitarian aid. And decisions were largely not respected. Regardless of many countries co-signing to it and expressing interest to join, notably some of them European. Therefore, Chubukchu asks, how exactly do we go through this hegemony? Need all roads lead to The Hague for addressing human disposability and mass atrocity? What if The Hague and its international courts are part of the problem, not only in their so-called incompetence, but also in their complete shielding of colonial entity from unsettling critique? So although a level of critique was allowed, it was in the end rather toothless because the decisions are not implemented. And another topic I would like to touch upon in this framework is what is our personal and collective responsibility, both during times of climate crisis and genocide, especially when it's legitimized by the organizations, governments, and universities that we collaborate with or not necessarily oppose or disrupt. And here I would like to share some thoughts of Hannah Arendt, who asked, how can we tell the right from wrong? And I think for those of us who work with young people as educators, these are very pertinent questions, because knowing right from wrong does not necessarily correspond with our knowledge of the law. So she, speaking of people who did not support the Nazi regime, said, the non-participants, called irresponsible by the majority, were the only ones who dared to judge by themselves, and they were capable of doing so not because they disposed of a better system of values. On the contrary, it was precisely the members of respectable society who had not been touched by the intellectual and moral upheaval. And she continues, they asked themselves to what extent they would still be able to live in peace with themselves after having committed certain deeds. The precondition for this kind of judging is not a highly developed intelligence or sophistication in moral matters, but rather the disposition to live together explicitly with oneself. And I thought this is quite insightful because we at times dedicate, or at least I have dedicated a lot of the time for, workshops and presentations in matters related to education, especially to youth. But I think what we see is that it is not the technical kind of knowledge or academic knowledge which makes the difference, is more the person's ability to reflect and stay grounded. Perhaps it can be connected to their being in nature and thinking for themselves to kind of go out of the more propaganda type of worldview. And then that would lead to the human rights, not in the capital letters as Hub would have described. Of course, we have to admit that there can be different perspectives on different matters, and is also one of the skills that should be prioritized in developing. Another question I wanted to kind of raise is, are we in a major upheaval? So Zygmunt Bauman spoke of toothless critique, which is very pertinent in Europe as a kind of everyday accessory. By toothless critique, he meant that normally citizens of European countries are very used to criticizing the governments and raising their opinion and objections. Usually that does not lead to any systemic type of change, but at least this can be expressed. And Bauman noted that this happens in all cases, barring major upheaval. So the question with the recent climate protests or pro-Palestine protests would be, are we in this situation or not? And so I would like to discuss a little bit the recent repressions of human rights. And I will start by saying that the protests by pupils and young people are not new and actually have featured throughout history. So, for example, in UK, there were mass walkouts of young people and pupils protesting the Iraq war. There was Catherine, a 16-year-old, who said, Tony Blair obviously doesn't think Iraqi children are too young to be bombed, so how can we be too young to protest? Similarly, Gaza also inspired multiple youth and adult-oriented action around the world and demanding governments to end their complicity in genocide. So perhaps differently to the normal response to toothless critique when people express objection and the government just does not care, a lot of the actions were met with riot police and arrest. For example, in the Netherlands, also in Germany, some activists faced deportation threats after a peaceful sit-in in the Berlin University, and this has happened throughout Europe. This, in a way, mirrors the developments within the climate action sphere. So, although initially the states, at least in the West, were warming up to the climate protesters and they were embracing them, sometimes they would themselves show up and say that, yes, we need kind of joint action to save the planet. But this kind of support has been waning, especially when young people started engaging in civil disobedience. So activists have been targeted in raids by the police of authorities for actions such as gluing themselves to the road or throwing mashed potatoes at famous paintings. In The Hague, the kind of center of justice, there were mass arrests of activists, and they were at risk of prosecution for vandalism and obstruction because they blocked a section of a motorway. And French activists were tear gassed during peaceful sit-ins as early as in 2019. So what is the role of youth work in this kind of very chaotic times? And then how do we make sure that it is not co-opted? So one of the scholars, Scott Mayre, argues that once grounded in radical traditions such as street-based services and community-based programming, youth work is at risk of losing its revolutionary potential and kind of just raising citizens which become the next cog in the machine. He argues that some services to support young people have instead become tools to integrate them better in a kind of socioeconomical order. So just catching the outliers who do not agree or cause a disturbance, and making sure that they're educated well to kind of support whatever is happening and not to raise any issues. And hence, he says, each time that we offer a course in skills without including a section that explains the exploitative nature of youth employment within multinational corporations, we are complicit in the continued exploitation of these young people. So, therefore, the topic of radical systems change have come up in my research, and it's not an easy kind of challenge to answer, but I will raise some points. So we know that if human rights depend purely on the intensification of capitalism and this perpetual economic growth, there will be little hope for economical, social, cultural rights, as well as planetary well-being, because we will not be living within the planetary boundaries anymore. And the merely economical and technological innovations will not save us from that. Hence, as Saavedra Vargas argues, we need to invest in a kind of decolonization of the minds of both adults and young people. And one of the frameworks which I found very interesting is the Morrison, who established different typologies of climate interventions. And I guess this could be established for different type of topics, including peace building and economical relations. So just looking into where do we fit with our interventions, whether we're coordinating a youth empowerment program, whether it's a short-term workshop or long-term education. So the 6 typologies, they cover interventions which are palliative or hopeful. So they contribute only to limited, slow, or even maladaptive change. So here the scholars argue that some, for example, technological innovations which capture the attention, ask for investment, and say, okay, we can keep on doing whatever we have been doing, and just focusing on economic growth and just invest in this technological advancement, and this will fix everything. In this way, kind of attracting a lot of attention and resources from the governments, but detracting them from kind of bigger picture. And other interventions can be tactical, partial, or strategic. So here we would probably place the protests and even civil disobedience, which will not by itself lead to big structural change, but it can stop and make people think or cause some disruption within the system. And of course, on the top, the deep radical transitions, which would require rethinking how the whole, both global governance systems work and our relation to nature and other people on a kind of more local level. Where does human rights approach fit within this? So we know that it has some limitations because the climate crisis, for example, is an interlinked global structural problem. It's not just a human rights problem. And therefore, there's a strong need to recognize the validity of different type of knowledges, including indigenous ones, and kind of challenging this, especially prevalent in Europe, this idea of universal knowledge or best practices that everyone should be implementing, which also tend to be predominantly white or Western in nature. And the other challenge with human rights is that often it prioritizes needs of humans above those of the entire ecosystem, even though all entities are intimately interconnected and responsible for one another. Nevertheless, we have to admit that human rights and human rights law have been well established, relatively speaking, across the world. So there have been many youth groups which have used it to litigate for the preservation of nature. And also a lot of the member states of the UN, in one way or another, have established environmental rights, if not in the constitutions, that in different legal mechanisms. So we see that even within this quite highly flawed system of human rights law and its implementation globally, it can be useful in some maybe strategic or tactical implementation to advance planetary well-being. Another very interesting development has been the rights of nature, which advocates to see beyond kind of possessive approach in how we relate to our natural environment. So I will share some practices from around the world. So we have Pachamama, Mother Earth rights in Ecuador and Bolivia, who started their constitutional and legal amendments to present alternatives to global capitalism. And it's related to the indigenous views known as the buen vivir or the good life. And Ecuador's constitution states nature, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. Then we had the Maori people in New Zealand who spearheaded the landmark case to protect the Wanganui River. And the court ruling recognized the river as a living ancestor and granted it legal personhood in 2017. And there, the co-governance models were established. Similar case later happened in the UK. I forgot the exact name, but I heard the presentation, and they were explaining how in some boards, for the governments on that particular entity, be it a river or lake, there would be a rotating person responsible who is tasked to speak on behalf of that lake or river. So they're just channeling them and kind of imagining, okay, if I were the river, what would be my needs for, lack of pollution? What limits would I try to put on fishing? What is allowed? What is not allowed? So there's quite a lot of innovation and creativity, and they're not definite answers, but there have been definitely kind of very starking developments. And then the last example I would like to highlight is the Nature Rights Zone in Italy, which became the first town in Europe to declare itself a nature rights zone and incorporate the nature rights principles into the local decision-making processes. And of course, the hope is that they do continue. So with all this in mind, what could be the way forward? I would argue that we need to embrace more alternative epistemologies and discourses to human rights. As Hubgut says, there has been a failure of kind of human rights as a set of hegemonic norms, so the well-established kind of universal norms that all accept on the basis that they're secular, universal, and non-negotiable. We see that we live in different realities and they do need to be adapted. And also, even if human rights were somehow magically universal for everyone, they're nevertheless not implemented because there are inherent power imbalances in the way the world is governed. Therefore, Hubhut says, we have entered an era of multipolar authority where what is normal or appropriate no longer has one answer. So no state or society for the foreseeable future will be able to turn diversity into universality, and not through coercion or inducement or persuasion. And hence he argues for vernacularization, which is a nice word, complicated to pronounce. And that means addressing different ways in which local people interpret and customize rights, and empower translators who want to assist them. And finally, and perhaps coming back to the Arendt's thoughts, focusing on embodied, more experiential learning and independent thinking in kind of processing this whole chaotic situation that the world is right now, in both connection to the climate crisis and different wars happening around the world. Before we jump in Q&A, I would like to invite you for a short practical exercise that would take around 5 minutes. You're welcome to join. If this time you would just rather listen in, then no worries. And perhaps it's something you could do with the young people that you're working with, or you could do it later just for your own reflection. So what this exercise needs is just a pen and paper. So the question before we begin this exercise was inspired by Arendt. And she said, I think we shall have to admit that there exist extreme situations in which responsibility for the world, which is primarily political, cannot be assumed because political responsibility always presupposes at least a minimum of political power. And she says, impotence or complete powerlessness is, I think, a valid excuse. And I think it's important to consider, especially for those in activism or working with young people that want to be politically active, is kind of addressing how much power do we have, and how can we take care of ourselves and our mental health, because we want to be sustainable in going forward. Because there have been many, many cases of activist burnout, and then the people are not able to contribute for their cause for a long, long time because their health, both mental and physical, have been impacted. So the exercise calls to consider our sphere of control, influence, and concern. So basically, if you had a piece of paper, you would first think of, let's say, a key issue that has been on your mind, or that has been bothering you, or that you want to contribute, whatever strong feelings that it brings. And then you would draw a circle in the middle, and that would be the sphere of control. So what do I control within here? Let's say it's my concern for climate. So what can I do? What can I do for myself in terms of my choices? What can I choose in terms of the content that I'm consuming, the education, etc. So that's our sphere of control. Then we draw another circle and we consider our sphere of influence. So my family, my project, my organization. So who can I influence or kind of help share information, etc. And beyond that, we establish the sphere of concern. So all of the things that are concerning us. And once that is done, I think a good reflection to engage in is whether any of the spheres should be reduced or expanded. So often what we see, especially working with activists, is that at times the sphere of control can be disproportionately small to the sphere of concern, because people get overwhelmed and they have a lot of information and so many things concern us. And for kind of sustainable engagement, it's good to make sure that we have a balance. And this is kind of an ongoing exercise that is good to engage in. And of course, we will not always have balance, but just kind of reflecting on that can help not to get completely overwhelmed, in both our action and inaction, and deciding how to behave when.
Oh, there is an input from Tatevik from Armenia. Yeah, actually she's writing, maybe I can read it for you, Neringa, that sphere of control, she can directly decide how she leads her organization, plan project, and communicate with the team and partners. She's in control of how she manages her time between work, family, and raising two children. Yeah, and she's telling that she, through her work, she can also inspire and motivate young people and women in her community and can build partnerships. So in a way, this is also sphere of influence.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think also for the context, maybe in Armenia, a working woman that is also running an organization, that would be something quite impressive in a very patriarchal society.
Hello.
Yes, Sabrina, please.
Yes. So for me, it was not really a question, but more a comment, because indeed we thank you for the presentation. It was very good. And when we are talking about human rights, we understand that rights are existing. We understand that there are some institution behind it, but it's very difficult to understand for the for the common people where I can go with my right to make it respected. Also in the presentation, so in our association we worked on some cases of the court. But you spoke, for example, about UNESCO at a certain point. On here, for example, I didn't get the link. Yeah, you had an example for the nature. So I think it will be very nice to have maybe more detail on which institution can make which rights respected. Yes,
That's a
thank
very
you.
good question. It's a big question. So of course, first we would start at the national levels because each country will have a set of laws that guarantee your rights, and then different level of courts, etc. On international level, we have had several cases at the European Court of Human Rights. Which can be pursued. Of course, it's often a lengthy and expensive process. Nevertheless, it is there, and it's incredibly kind of powerful mechanism that, in this case, only Europeans have. What has been interesting with the nature rights movement is that they have been using the laws to protect human rights just because they're really established in the legal system. Of course, we'll have different minoritized groups, especially who can still struggle to assert their rights. But nevertheless, the laws are there. Whereas the laws for nature are really new. So we'll have only a handful of countries that have established, for example, the rights of nature. So many of the activists, they will use human rights framework to advocate for climate action. So, for example, the human right to a healthy environment has been increasingly recognized. So they said, okay, we don't have yet the kind of the laws just protect the nature because it's important, hasn't been developed. So like let's use these human rights mechanisms. And actually, I think I'll have it in the resource list that I'll share. Recently, we wrote a publication for the EU Youth Partnership on Youth Climate Litigation. So there we spoke kind of precisely where the rights of nature have been litigated and how and what kind of different strategies young people were using to achieve them.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, for raising your voice and for bringing your perspective and asking giving your comment. How do you evaluate the seriousness of the global public opinion and planners' inclination towards these issues we have been discussing? I would maybe paraphrase it a little bit. With you were giving examples when, for example, the higher authorities are critically reflecting or like giving negative feedback about certain things happening in the world, let's say situation in Gaza, and then still these decisions are not respected. So this is definitely somehow shifting public opinion on the seriousness of such arbitrary bodies. What is your personal opinion on this, and maybe what could be an alternative of creating, I don't know, a different or developing a different narrative to counter this injustice?
These are like big political, philosophical questions. So I think I'll touch upon two dimensions on this. So one, I think, is kind of having power and then enacting power. So public opinion by itself does not necessarily hold much power and much sway. It does to some extent. Largely coming back to Bauman and his description of this toothless critique, that we can critique, but then the critique doesn't have teeth, so does not necessarily make a difference. I think what has been concerning a lot of both academics, activists, etc., that sometimes even that critique gets censored. So we had kind of prohibition from freedom of assembly or the right to protest and express dissatisfaction. So I think here these rights really need to be safeguarded. Where they will be, we don't know. But so here comes the kind of importance of resistance. And then reflecting very beautifully how some people shared here in the chat their sphere of influence and the sphere of concern and their sphere of power. So like doing what I can to maybe resist and try to enact change, but also not overwhelming myself with all troubles of the world, because then that just makes that person perhaps not do anything because everything will seem very futile. And also just reflecting on the kind of recent maybe geopolitical developments, it would be maybe naive to think that any systemic change would come from Europe or from the US, mainly because it does benefit from the current kind of global economic and political system and has all the headquarters of the key institutions. There wasn't UNESCO mentioned, but of course we have the IMF, we have the World Bank. So I don't think people, especially in Europe, can enact some level of change. I don't think systemic change will come. I think it might come with more like shifting powers, and maybe if there's more solidarity and the strengthening of the global South, then probably Europe and US will be more willing to negotiate. If not, I don't think it will just come from good heart or, kind of the vision of that the Red Cross had.
Yeah, I understand. So then the solution is that this small, well, first of all, we need to work all together to make this world multipolar, and that there are other places in which rise of human rights resistance movements is happening, and we also acknowledge our white privilege, acknowledge our Eurocentric or West-centric approaches, and try to maybe on a personal level even sometimes leave space for other actors to come in. I think that's also something. Actually, speaking about the spheres of control, influence, and concern, we actually have one more interesting example here from Saure. Yes, it's never too late to share examples, so please do so. But Saure is saying that the sphere of control is care about animals, make sure to do what I can for them, like carrying water bowl or something. I think it's also setting an example. By setting an example, I can influence others. So I think we can use our power. Indeed, like small actions, we never consider them important, but maybe they have a potential in them. And I would like to ask maybe another question coming from different comments we had throughout the talk. What to do when you feel hopeless or helpless? Like you have certain big topics that you are sad about, that you are concerned about, that you are truly caring for, but somehow don't see a way how to influence it even, or voice it even. What could be done, especially maybe by the youth work community, since majority of us here are somehow connected to youth work field. Yeah.
Well, it's a challenging question. I think also reflecting where our interventions fit. If we come back to kind of Morrison's typology, and also what the researcher from UK, Scott Meyer, said, at least considering, are we just kind of there to raise dutiful citizens that fall in line with whatever the government policy is? Or do we kind of have an obligation to inspire more creative thinking, maybe civil resistance at times, etc.? So I think just having these kind of background questions in mind can help maybe to improve. I'm sure already youth workers are doing amazing job, and often it's very kind of holistically minded people already. But sometimes these considerations can be very helpful, especially when we are often put in the positions where we have to work with maybe government or the funder priorities, which can at times trump whatever we wanted to do in the first place. So just kind of keeping it in mind and then negotiating between the two.
We have been teaching young people that their rights are very important, that they should protect their rights. This is a responsibility of every youth worker. I imagine that we tell young people to stand for their rights, to claim their rights, and somehow to empower them for fighting for their rights. And now we are coming to a moment when maybe human rights are in conflict with other rights of nature, of other species and creatures. How does it change the narrative of us talking to young people about their rights? Do we do something else? Are we maybe not doing something right? And how do we explain that maybe these two types of rights can go together?
Yeah, I think the kind of human rights crisis, if we write the human rights in the capital, it's not really new. So in a way, it has always been in conflict, in kind of prioritizing the human at the expense of, for example, the environment of nature. In some perspectives, in many indigenous perspectives, that was already a conflict. It was perhaps not so visible because of this idealization of human rights. I mean, that was my own activism journey, which we thought is the kind of this shining concept that we all have to fight for, and the main one, and also kind of believing that it's really universal and meaning the same things for different people. So even answering to this question, I think it all has to be contextual. And there's a lot of advice I also think that international experts cannot necessarily give for people working at the local level, because a lot of considerations will be very different. Like what is the best from the perspective of planetary well-being, for example, which takes the issue of climate change, the well-being of the planet, and the well-being of humans into one. And let's say in my town of Klaipėda, I work with young people. So then I was thinking in the context here, what are our priorities and kind of how to bring it to life? And then, of course, at some level, considering how do we perhaps include some values of global citizenship or concern for the world, and kind of supporting this interconnectedness, but also not in a way that gets people overwhelmed. Because also, as someone who has worked on sustainability and climate, often when we spoke with youth workers, they said, okay, we're already overworked and we just have few part-time staff and volunteers, and now you want us to invest all this time to make the project sustainable, etc. And then now you want us to address issues of war, etc. in our trainings. And they say it gets very overwhelming very fast, especially in a sector that is already kind of working at maximum capacity a lot of the time. So it'd be difficult, like very difficult to give advice. Can just give some reflections, and then this kind of sphere of concern to make sure that at least mentally we feel well and we don't feel overwhelmed and in kind of this perpetual guilt that we're not doing enough.
I have an even stronger moral dilemma to bring to the table. So our first speaker of this season was bringing this example. Well, we talked a little bit about who is human. And with artificial intelligence, and sometimes even a robot being given citizenship in a country, maybe the story that there is this robot Sophia that was granted citizenship, I think in Saudi Arabia, at the same time, so basically granting rights, right? This maybe brings even further complexity, like what is human to claim rights, what rights human can claim, or what type of human can claim what rights. So I think this is also like bringing us in a very different place of thinking, reflecting about human rights, if we are even in this stage defining what is human. Yeah. So if you want to address this or to comment on this, and then we have a couple of reflections and questions in the chat.
No, I think that's a good reflection and opening up new kind of territories. I mean, similar thing with space exploration, right? Like we have not yet fully solved the kind of challenges we have here on this planet, and then we want to kind of colonize other planets. So yeah, there are big questions that intertwine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I see that Abdelila has a question. So how we can give youth, young people, the right expectations about what can do exactly, not to get disappointed. Even though here up, Saure was encouraging us not to drain energy on the things we cannot control. So maybe if you could address these two things, and maybe regarding the AI rights. Well, yes, the recent news is that there is a minister in Albania that is AI, that is responsible for state procurements, as far as I remember, to stay impartial. So yeah, maybe this AI topic we park for the moment because this is a big thing and maybe not the topic of today, but still another dimension of thinking about it. And I would rather encourage maybe Neringa if we can address this question of Abdelila on how we can give the young people right expectations about what they can do and not get them disappointed.
That's a good question. I'll take one angle to this, maybe coming back to the sphere of concern and sphere of influence, and then what is within our power. From the perspective, what is within our power, we cannot really ensure young people or anyone will not get disappointed because it's really not up to us. Probably even if we're the minister of a country, we cannot kind of guarantee people will not get disappointed because they will have different opinions, and also because we will be bound by different power structures. So I think as youth workers, we cannot take that responsibility for ourselves. Maybe what we can do is prepare them and then support them in their journey. Whether it's a peaceful protest, maybe some e-activism, can be civil disobedience, can be contributing in a different way to different causes that they care about. And I think disappointment will come at one point or another, and it's just, I guess, the fact of life. Here we would probably enter the discussion of kind of mental health and how to make sure that we are resilient and we can help other young people to process their emotions and disappointments, which will inevitably come, probably has come for all of us at one point or another in our career.
Thank you very much. Anything that you would like to add, Neringa, to the talk that you hadn't had an opportunity to speak yet, to say yet? Because I know we put a lot of time pressure on you and we kind of forced you to really rush through your presentation that could easily be a training day, a whole day training course. But if there is maybe some important messages that you would like to highlight, something that we could take out from today. So if there is maybe 3 things that the participants of today's ID talk are taking back to them, to their work, to their young people, what would those be? If you could give it a kind of think about it and give a little overview, because I think we will finish shortly. Yeah, so what do I take out of this ID talk today? What can I implement in my daily practice? What would be your 3 maybe insights or suggestions?
That's also a challenge, especially considering all the discussion that we had with the participants together. I feel like we could have made a second presentation and probably a third one, then considering the AI and space colonization. I think coming back to the spheres, just interrogating the questions of power. And then when we have the capacity to engage in this, to kind of look at different things from different perspectives. Even in my own journey of kind of human rights, what started in one way and was perhaps more naive, later you read something and it just shifts your perspective completely, and then you come back to it. So it's an ongoing journey, and I think kind of help facilitate this process for others, not necessarily in a brutal way, but not idealizing any one approach or set of laws or institutions or countries that we kind of put on pedestal, and later we become very disappointed because they do not stand up to the kind of values that they proclaimed. I think also the well-being of ourselves and the people that we work with. And I kind of see from the comments here that people already invest a lot of time and get overwhelmed very easily. So how do we deal with that? And then, of course, on top of this, we'll have all the questions of kind of censorship and that impact on us. So I think mental health and well-being will be a big topic. And lastly, coming back to Hannah Arendt, I think the importance of independent thinking. So we saw that there were a lot of kind of global crises when it was not about knowing the law the best or kind of presenting oneself as knowing a lot and discussing moral philosophy, etc. It was just kind of us being able, the people being able to be with themselves, prioritizing that. And that comes with grounding and kind of knowing who you are, and feeling confidence in that. And these things are perhaps hard to teach. I don't know. I'm not a professional youth worker in that sense. I think many people here would know it much better. But how do we hold space for the development of this? So, not necessarily what we do now, which is a lot of things that go on this purely mind-based focus, like the intellectual, knowing what is where and what laws are existing and how they're developing. But how do we support the kind of holistic well-being of young people? And probably that would then require more kind of discussion together. Not one person can answer. I can just add like a small part of my expertise on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this message of not only knowing, but also educating young people to be, or to have the values, or to develop their skills of critical thinking. I think this is also something super, super relevant, and something already youth work is doing very much about. But I mean, in this situation that the world is right now, I think the only way is the way forward. I mean, we need to, if we stop doing it, nobody's going to do it instead of us. And we just need to be gentle on ourselves and try to do it in a mindful way. Thank you very much. I forgot in the very beginning of today's webinar, I was a little bit stressed that we are maybe running behind with the opening. I forgot to mention that there will be a wizard working in the background of all of this. Her name is Olaja. She's our graphic recorder, our graphic facilitator. She's in the background making notes of the speech of Neringa. And I think she's also ready to share those notes. So I will pass you now, Ola, the floor to share what you have so far. And then we come back to close today's ID talk.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I'm
We can.
sharing the screen now. So this is the first draft of today's talk. As you see, there is a little gap at the end. This will be revised with this three summarizing ideas that Neringa shared. But yeah, my take is on this. Really interesting to think about human rights with a critical eye, from a critical perspective, without taking them for granted, or just understanding that, yeah, that's everything, unquestionably what we need to go for, but also without analyzing ourselves or societies or the systems all embedded in. So yeah, this was a lot of good points, I would say. Not so common points. So definitely something for us to think about and analyze in our daily practice as well, I believe.
Thank you, Ola. You never stop amazing us with how somebody can do this in like real time. Thanks a lot for that. And Neringa, we are almost there to close today's ID talk. If there is maybe something you would like to still add or to say, you have the floor for some final words.
Thank you for sharing the graphic recording. I think it looked amazing. Also, I'm happy, well, both happy and kind of sad to hear that some points were not common points. I think there could be a more kind of mainstream discourse. And that's why I will thank everyone who participated in kind of bearing with me through this, perhaps at times a bit chaotic presentation, because so many different systems feed into the topics that we are discussing. I think I will be sharing an article on this, but if useful, I could share the slides. So if anyone was interested to kind of maybe use some of this material in discussing with young people or colleagues that you work with in kind of, adapting it and making it your own type of workshop, if you find something useful, then I would be happy to do that. And yeah, thank you for participating and all the questions and the suggestions. I think every single comment was really useful for this kind of grander debate. And I hope to see more of it, across everywhere.
And then on behalf of our team of the ID Talks, we want to thank you, Neringa, for today's input. I think it was very important and very, let's say, holistic in a sense, giving us a frame to take and to think and to reflect about. I really hope that there will be other opportunities that we continue this discussion, and to our participants and audience on Facebook, thank you very much for joining us today, and we will come back 2 weeks later on a Wednesday, 15th, for the next ID Talks. So the topic of the next ID Talks is social justice and activism. So actually very nicely knitting into the topic that we have this week. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.